Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to give folks about 30 seconds to join. Appreciate we've got 30 minutes today, so we're going to be pretty quick. So we'll be able to wait too long, but we'll just give people a couple seconds to join. All right. Just a couple of housekeeping points as we start. So you'll notice there's a Q&A box within the Zoom webinar thing. So feel free to drop a question in there. I'll keep an eye on it throughout the course of the session today and try to get any of these questions answered in line with the presentation today. I have also set up a little bit of a poll here for folks. So you can do it right now. Or you can do it over the course of today. So please feel free to fill that out. And we're going to get started. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Will Lytle. I'm the CEO of Plandek. I look after all of our existing and new customers here. Today, we're going to take a whistle-stop tour really through our 2025 benchmarks. And before jumping into that, I did want to do a little bit of scene setting. So the idea of productivity has really come into focus that we've seen, certainly from our perspective with our customers and with prospects we've been talking about over the last 12 to 18 months. And there's a number of factors driving this. First and foremost, investors are looking towards CTOs and technology leaders to really be able to demonstrate this concept of productivity as it relates to the investment that they put into R&D teams. And that, I think, largely stemmed from a high cost of capital that still remains generally high across all of the sectors, certainly in the European and US and Canadian sectors in particular. Some of the industries are rebounding, but overall growth has still been slow in the markets. And I'm sure we don't have to talk in too much detail, but geopolitics is increasingly volatile, and certainly with a lot of challenges that are happening with tariffs in different trade markets. That is probably more true now than it ever has been before. And really with the new generation of tools that are promising to accelerate productivity, and I'm thinking really around generative and agentic AI tools, putting even more emphasis on this concept of productivity. Across our customer base, we're seeing very similar things, right? So there's a real strong focus on either cost reduction or cost avoidance in 2024 and 2025. More CTOs, CPTOs, and similar are being asked to do a lot more with less, right? So we're seeing a number of our customers with reduced budgets, many of them with, bespoke implemented cost freezes, and only a really small proportion of technology leaders across our customer base are reporting that they're having increased budgets at this point in time. Now, in line with that, many of the folks on the call here will be very well aware of the number of different tools at your disposal today around generative and now agentic tools that have really been marketed very effectively. I don't mean effectively in terms of necessarily we're always proving this to be the case, but effectively in terms of really changing market expectation around these tools' ability to have a direct and immediate impact on engineering and delivery productivity. And yet, with a number of customers that we speak to, and I think a lot of the surveys that have been run through the market these days, there are a lot of teams that are really struggling to realize the full value of generative and agentic AI tools. And largely from our perspective, what we're seeing is because these tools, whether it's GitHub Copilot or any of the number, no free advertising, number of tools that are being marketed out there today, they can be very good at individual task execution, but the ability to translate that task execution with an engineering team, one that's working within a complex system, doesn't necessarily translate into higher productivity for the team, right? It might accelerate one aspect of that process, but being able to translate it to overall productivity is quite challenging. So today, before we jump into the benchmarks, I want to do a little bit of scene setting on number one, sort of how do you start to measure and think about increasing productivity within your engineering functions? Number two is we're going to take a look at Plandek's 4 pillars of productivity. So some thinking we've done around this idea of understanding productivity and how to drive productivity. And ultimately, that is what our 2025 benchmark reports are based on. So we're going to take a look at those 2025 report, and we're also going to look at some of the key trends that we're seeing in the data today. So first off, how do we start to define productivity in software engineering? Engineering oftentimes is compared to car manufacturing, but we are not manufacturing cars. We don't have the luxury of being able to count the amount of cars being produced at the end of the week or the end of the month. What we produce in software engineering is a lot more virtual, a lot more complex, and a lot more sophisticated than simply understanding cars. So how do we then start to think about this concept of productivity when we don't have the benefit of being able to count a consistent output from a system that you would typically find in car manufacturing or other manufacturing plants? Ultimately, at the end of the day, a lot of people, when they start to think about productivity, what we're really trying to optimize are business outcomes. We're trying to understand how can we focus our teams in effective ways and in efficient ways so that we can deliver the most amount of value for our business. And the easiest way to start to think about value, right, in terms of value being delivered to our business counterparts and value being delivered to our customers, is ultimately equated on a revenue side of things, okay? So I find oftentimes that this ratio, which is commonly used across private equity in particular, looking at different product areas and different businesses, but also really fundamental to any business that's running, is really understanding how can we maximize the amount of revenue that we're driving at the most efficient cost base. And so from productivity perspective, while we oftentimes don't think about, how do I go from product engineering or development engineering into this cost and revenue model, what it is doing actually is helping us understand, okay, at a specific cost base, how do we continue to optimize the revenue that we're seeing from our products in terms of A, picking the right things, but also B, being able to deliver those new features that are going to move the needle on revenue as quickly and efficiently as possible. So from here, we started thinking, okay, well, what does the typical team look like? And how do you then start to think about how do we maximize that time that teams have to deliver and optimize the amount of value that's delivering for customers? And this is a very simple diagram, but a very kind of simple waterfall diagram to help us think about, at the start of the day, we have it, every team has 100% of capacity, 100% of their time, okay? How we spend that time ultimately is dictated by a few different areas. One is most businesses, particularly if you're working in regulatory businesses like banking, there's a certain level of work that you're going to have to maintain on what we call essential planned work, right? And this could be regulatory work, it can be compliance work, but also it's technical debt. And all of us who are delivering products today, we all have some level of commitment that we need to make to the space, whether it's 30% of your capacity or 10% or 50%. The important thing is that we stay fixed within that. If we're going to commit to do 30%, let's make sure we stay within those boundaries. The next bit is unplanned work, right? And it's not just sort of bugs popping up out of nowhere. Naturally, every software that's being produced is going to have some level of defects, some level of bugs that we need to work through. But we have to work through those in two ways. One, we have to have a controlled sense. So if we're planning on 15%, 20% of our work actually going through and supporting the bugs and defects that we're finding as part of the natural SDLC process, we need to stay within that. But also, how we spend time and how we prioritize bugs is actually really, really important to capacity. So the longer a bug spends in the backlog, the more time it's going to take an engineer to fix it. So while we might make decisions short-term on prioritizing one story over a bug, in reality, if we continue to replicate that over time, our bug backlog, our technical debt increases, we're actually going to have to spend more of our capacity paying that down in the future because we've made a short-term decision for a particular story over a particular bug. So the reduction of unplanned work, right, the things that we didn't expect to see, or the overextension of the time that we spent on that type of work, is really, really, really important in terms of how that has an impact on our overall team capacity. The next bit of that is how we deliver, right? So think of this as just the general flow state of a team, right? You're going to have efficiencies, you're going to have inefficiencies, there's going to be bottlenecks in the process. So being able to understand that SDLC end to end, understand exactly where those inefficiencies are and improve that, is ultimately going to translate into more capacity for roadmap. So the idea really about this is thinking, okay, we need to maintain focus on the right things. We want to minimize the unplanned work that we have, and we want to improve the speed and efficiency. By doing all three of these, fundamentally, that's going to translate into more capacity for value delivery, right? And assuming that your teams have a good understanding of what's going to drive the needle in revenues or engagement with customers, that's ultimately what's going to deliver better business outcomes for your business and for your customers, and what's going to move the needle on the revenue side of things. So if we take a look at Plandek's 4 pillars of productivity, we started thinking, okay, well, to really maximize this, what are the kind of core behaviors that you want to drive within software engineering that are really going to optimize and maximize the amount of time that you have for a team to focus on delivering value? And we still distilled it down into these real 4 behaviors. Now, each one of these 4 pillars are going to have a measurable set of areas within that, so you can understand, okay, if we're trying to drive speed and predictability, how do we measure that? How do we understand where we are on the journey for that? This is really ultimately both, let's say the 4 pillars have 2 types of input into it, right? One, which we're going to focus on today, which is a lot more of the quant side. So products like Plandek allow you to really quantify and measure this, but it doesn't mean we would underestimate or underemphasize the qualitative input as well. So it's very important as part of this, as part of speed, predictability, quality, and focus, understanding the qual input for teams. How are they feeling? How are they feeling supported? Are they actually feeling aligned with what they're delivering? So we'll go into that maybe a little bit later, but right now we're going to stay focused on the 4 pillars. So speed, the ability for a team to really deliver value quickly with minimum waste in that process. It doesn't mean no waste, right? There's always going to be inefficiencies in how we deliver, but understanding where those inefficiencies lie are really important. And as such, understanding your lead time to value, your cycle time, your lead time for change, your deployment frequencies, these are the core metrics for every team, whether you're working in Scrum or Kanban or otherwise. It's really going to help you identify where you are on the sort of speed spectrum, but also exactly where those bottlenecks lie and what you can do to start to optimize those. Secondly is predictability, right? The ability to do what you say you're going to do. And that's really critical when trying to align with roadmaps, particularly when roadmaps are delivering new features, new value, which are closely intertwined with other business functions, sales, marketing, and so on and so forth, that are trying to bring this to market and actually sell it. So understanding your sprint completion, your velocity variance, your scope churn, and your planning accuracy, all 4 of those areas are going to be very, very key to understanding, okay, as a team or as a product area, how predictable are we? How effective are we at being able to tell somebody, yes, we'll be able to deliver these different features by the end of this month or by the end of this quarter, and build a lot of confidence with that business that it will be delivered, but also being able to deliver that such that whatever plans that you have in your business plan this year have the opportunity to be realized from a sales and from a marketing perspective as well. On the quality side, your story to defect ratio is actually really, really important. So being able to understand, as we increase our velocity, what is the quality that we're seeing behind that? Are we balancing, the bugs created with the bugs resolved so that we're not picking up a very large backlog of technical debt that ultimately is going to have to be paid down in the future at a higher cost, which we spoke about a little bit before. That bug resolution time is the thing that's going to be a really good litmus test for you to be able to understand exactly where you are and how responsive you are to issues popping up in the SDLC, our ability to resolve them, either ship products faster, or if the products can go ahead with those bugs, at least making sure that we're not picking up a huge amount of technical debt, which is going to weigh down on our capacity going forward. And obviously your return rates. So being able to understand, as we go through that SDLC, what proportion of the things we're trying to deliver actually have key regressions in them that's causing us to spin our wheels a little bit in terms of what we're delivering. And last, but certainly not least, is our focus, right? What is the time that we're actually spending on value delivery, right? Delivery of features, epics, whatever, that are going to really move the needle on our business revenues. Number 2 is your sort of whip limit around the epics and features, right? So teams that deliver 5, 6 epics at the same time are going to deliver them far less efficiently than teams that demonstrate a good level of focus on, let's say, 2 epics. So it's really important to understand how clear are teams and what the priorities are, how focused are they on delivering those priorities, and making sure they're not being spread too thin. And certainly from a senior leadership perspective and a board perspective, understanding then how does that translate to where our investment distribution is going? How much of our time are we spending on delivering roadmap features that are going to move the needle? How much time are we spending on technical debt? How much time are we spending on support and maintenance? Very, very critical bit. And really understanding your speed, your predictability, your quality, your focus And each one of these metrics within there is really going to help businesses understand how do they ultimately drive better productivity, insofar as productivity is really about making sure that you're optimizing the amount of time that teams have to focus on new value delivery and driving business outcomes in the way that is going to help drive revenues for your side. Now, jumping into our 2025 benchmarks and key trends, just a bit. So we launched these back in February, so a few months ago. If you're one of our customers, you will have already seen the Q2 version of these come out. And if you haven't seen them yet, do reach out to your Agile Success Manager. That will definitely factor in as part of your next QBR. These benchmarks look across over 1,700 teams that are currently using Plandek today, right? So a very broad set of teams working in a lot of different environments. It gives us a very good sense of exactly where the market is and understanding kind of since last year when we published the 2024 benchmarks, how have things moved, how have they changed, and so on. One of the things that we're starting to see from 2024 in particular is that there's definitely a gap that's widening between the top and the bottom performers. The bottom performers are staying relatively stagnant, so the data points in the benchmarks themselves haven't moved a lot, but the top performers are definitely distancing themselves. They're getting faster, they're getting more predictable, they're maintaining quality better. And so that's very interesting to see that the top performing teams are getting better. That gap is widening. So it's an interesting point. Right? Now, in terms of the benchmarks themselves, so we talked about focus, speed, predictability, and quality. Now, the benchmarks that you see here are a slight subset of the overall 4 pillars. And naturally, because some of those 4 pillars, whilst they're, I think, critical for individual customers, they can be very difficult to actually benchmark across a large community of different Plandek teams. But these are the ones that we've really focused on for the 2025 benchmarks. So from a focus perspective, planned work, I think the really key thing is the top quartile is really, really clear in what they need to do in optimizing time being spent on things delivering value or planned work that they have. So 85% of all the work that they're working on falls under that planned work category. Sort of average max WIP per assignee, teams and individuals are very, very clear and very, very focused on what they need to do. And that epic context switching, that feature context switching is minimized quite extensively. And we've seen from a number of customers that context switching, teams that have the advantage of being able to focus on 2 to 3 epics and no more at the same time has a huge impact on actually their lead time to value, their cycle time, their sprint predictability, and the quality. And it makes absolute sense because if a team is very clear on what they need to work on, they can focus their time and energy in those particular areas, optimize the feedback loops for any quality issues that they find, really be able to focus on what the solution is that they're trying to build, how are we going to build this, collect it in a team, and really focusing on driving that into production as quickly as possible. So I really want to emphasize to folks today that if you're really trying to move the needle on speed, predictability, and quality, have a look at how effective teams are actually able to focus on the amount of epics that they're working on or the amount of new features that they're working on, because that very likely is an important leading indicator for how efficient that team is going to be. On the speed side of things, we definitely have seen some movement here. So that gap between lead time to value, 41 days to 21 days for the bottom and the top quartile has grown quite considerably. Cycle time has maintained about the same. One of the new areas that we added in for our 2025 benchmarks is the time to deploy, as well as the average merge frequency per author per week, right? To give you a good indication of, across, whether it's merge requests or pull requests, depending on the tool that you're using, what's the sort of expectation we should be setting? And it's not necessarily that 2.4 PRs means that somebody is working more. That might be the case, but it also could be the case that that team is doing a more effective job of actually breaking down work, and those PRs therefore are a bit smaller in size, lower in risk, and easier to deliver. So it gives you a good reference point. On the predictability side, this is quite interesting. And I think one of the key takeaways that we had initially when we looked back in February and March at this data was that Scrum teams, the ones that typically, when you're trying to really drive predictability and alignment with roadmaps, typically teams will pick Scrum as the methodology of, unless you're very kind of mature and can work within the Kanban style that way. Most teams will pick Scrum. And what we're seeing still is that a number of teams are really, really, really still struggling with the core ability to maintain scope. So if we look at the scope change here at the bottom, this was one that we added this year. And yet the top quartile, still experiences almost 50% scope change within the context of each sprint, right? Which has a pretty significant impact on why still even the top quartile only delivers about 70% of what they plan. Now, the other one that we've added this year is the sprint capacity accuracy. Okay, so if we think about this as, we plan to do, I don't know, 10 tickets this sprint. Okay, but we actually finished 20 tickets this sprint. What this looks at is what a team actually delivered divided by what it planned to deliver, and this helps you understand the extreme ends of challenges that Scrum teams often have. So, are we over planning and under delivering? That's where you'll start to see this number drop quite far below 100%, or where teams are under planning but over delivering, right? So maybe they're being a little bit cautious about what they can deliver, and then they're not taking a lot of work on during the sprint. You'll see that number creep up quite extensively over 100%. So these boundaries here help you really understand, teams in the bottom quartile are, what they deliver ultimately is 70% of what they planned. So they're over planning and under delivering, or 130% means that they're delivering 13 for every 10. So they're under planning, but over delivering. And neither of those at an extreme are going to be very beneficial, because either teams are always going to miss commitments because they're over planning, or they're under committing in what they can do, but always over delivering, which doesn't typically mean they're over delivering the roadmap. It typically means that they're over delivering other things, which are not aligned with the product team, because aligning with the product team is essential in terms of making sure they're getting a good handover of those requirements that's going to drive the roadmap. On the quality side of things, we see data roughly stay very similar, but two things that we've added this year. Bug resolution time was a key one for us last year, but to help people really understand, are we cherry picking bugs? We added this bugs resolved to bugs raised ratio. And this gives you a good sense of, are we raising more than we're resolving? And if we are raising more than we're resolving, that means that we have a growing backlog. And even if our bug resolution time is quite good, probably means we're cherry picking. And actually, at some point in time, we're going to have to go back into that backlog, burn it down. And that's going to be, again, quite costly to the engineering team itself that's having to go back and pick up bugs that maybe it's been sitting on the backlog for a month, 2 months, or sometimes even more, we see in some of the customer data. And then the other one here, which is worth considering, that this is one that's carried over from last year's, our bugs delivered, stories delivered to bugs raised ratio. And this again gives you a good understanding of, for every story that we're delivering, how many bugs are being raised on the back of that. Okay, this is a good indication of quality, but it's also a really good indication of how effectively we're breaking down the stories in the first place. So if we start to see, bugs increasing as per story, so we have 4 bugs for every story that we're delivering, chances are it's not just a quality issue, or it might be a quality issue that is a response to stories that are quite big in nature, quite complex in nature, and naturally have a lot of ambiguity and a lot of room for developers to maybe go a little bit off piece and have quality issues on that side of things, whether it's requirements quality or actual development quality. So it's a really good balanced way of being able to understand how those two relate. Now, I've simplified here, some of the key points from what we said before in terms of the gap between the top and the bottom performers widening. From a focus perspective, top performing teams are continuing to distance themselves and really being focused on planned work. They have a really good sense of exactly what their capacity is, what the priorities are, and being able to allocate a lot of their time, whether it's the delivery of new features or technical debt. This is key roadmap work that they need to be able to deliver, and they're very effective at allocating their time towards that. They're also very efficient at delivering, from idea to production. So when it comes to lead time to value, we saw a pretty big reduction. Last year was about 26 days. This year is 21 days. That reduction is a good indication that the teams are continuing to optimize how they work with product owners and how they maximize their pipeline so that they can deliver incrementally and very efficiently to their customers. On a predictability side, there's a pretty big gap, as you can see here. So the bottom quartile of teams tend to do less than what they've actually planned in each sprint, which is not going to lead to particularly great outcomes. High-performing teams are definitely better at it. We would argue that the area that you should be aiming for is about 80 to 90%. So even the top quartile, we think, still has some work to do, but they do have a very strong alignment generally with their business counterparts and being able to understand, okay, what do we need to deliver? When are we going to deliver that? And generally being able to get those done on time. And then from a quality perspective, this is again where we see a big gap as well. And it's kind of hard to pinpoint this in the data because 22 days for the bottom quartile is sort of the border between the bottom and the lower mid. So 22 days is actually the best of. A lot of teams that are within this bottom quartile, unfortunately, have data which is much worse than this, sometimes 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, or even higher, believe it or not. Whereas the teams that are really efficient are very good at being able to get the feedback quickly from QA, look at it and address it very quickly in a way that is a highly efficient use of their engineering capacity. And the benefit for there is if I can get a bug sorted very quickly, then I can reallocate my time and my focus to delivering things that really matter. Okay, so something for technology leaders to really think about is, quality isn't just about minimizing the amount of defects that you ship into production, but also thinking how are we spending our time resolving those issues before they ever get into production, and isn't that leading to ways that are going to drive better efficiency and better capacity for us to deliver value. So some of the key takeaways for today, I think the key point that really want to take away is understanding that productivity is really about optimizing your team's ability to deliver business outcomes, right? And the easiest way to start to think about that is that relationship between revenue and cost, right? If we have an engineering team that's working on a fixed cost base, how can we ultimately optimize the revenue that we're going to drive? And that's a combination of, not only how we deliver software, obviously that's really critical in terms of time to market, but naturally how we work with the product teams and making sure that we've got the right things in the backlog and the right things being pulled off the backlog that are going to drive those outcomes. Knowing that your teams are focused on the right things and delivering in the right way is absolutely critical. Okay, so understanding your focus, your speed, your predictability, and your quality, those are going to be really key to understanding how can you ultimately maximize the amount of time that you have to deliver those business outcomes. Now, we would recommend to establish a framework to measure and improve productivity. So whether you use the 4 pillars from Plandek or a subset of that or something else, having a really good sense and understanding of what does productivity mean within your organization, what are the outcomes you want to steer a team towards, and how are you going to measure that is absolutely essential. And making those outcomes part of your regular conversations with teams is absolutely essential as well. Okay, so this can't just be a management exercise. It can't just be a top-down, send us a report of where you are every month. This really needs to be part of the regular conversation and engagement, getting teams to really think about how are we focusing our time, how efficient are we, where are the bottlenecks, what are we doing to resolve those, are we responding to defects with the appropriate amount of prioritization and not just making short-term decisions at the cost of capacity long-term. Really, really important. So that takes us through the 30 minutes today, a couple minutes in advance. If you haven't had the chance, please do fill out the poll that we've posted in the webinar today. When you leave the webinar, you'll also be asked to fill out a survey, just so you know that survey is the same as the poll. So you don't need to fill that out if you've already filled out the poll. But if you haven't filled out the poll yet, please do, or just wait to do the survey at the end of the call. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and I hope you have a lovely week. Cheers.